Man of the people, Joe Biden, will be vacationing for the Thanksgiving holiday in Nantucket, which is fine. Nothing wrong with Nantucket. You know, you want to go chill in Nantucket. I'm not hating. However, I might hate on you a little bit if you're hanging out in the home of private equity billionaire David Rubenstein. Now, the president and First Lady Jill Biden touched down in Nantucket Tuesday night to spend the holiday week with extended family, planning to stay at the home of their friend, David Rubenstein, as they have done, the White House told reporters. And they've apparently done this. They've gone to Nantucket every year in a row for a very long period of time. Who knows? I don't care about that. What I do care about, again, is the fact that they're chilling in Rubenstein's home. So what's wrong with Rubenstein? Well, he's the co-founder and also co-CEO of just this small private equity firm called the Carlyle Group, which has a long, shady history. I'm sure we'll be getting into more details about that history later in the show. But I do want to talk a little bit about how the press seems to think it might be a little bit problematic, but they don't really know how to frame their question. Case in point, we have Peter Doocy asking White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki about Biden's decision to stay in a private equity billionaire's home in Nantucket during the break. Let's watch.
What message does it send to the middle-class Americans President Biden says that he's trying to help, who are struggling this week to cover the cost of the most expensive Thanksgiving ever, that the president is going to take a few days off at a billionaire's compound in Nantucket?
Well, first I would say, I don't know if you've cooked a turkey before, but a 20-pound turkey is a pretty big turkey. I think we can all agree. They're about $1 more. So not to minimize that, any increase in prices is something the president is concerned about, as is evidenced by his announcement today and as his efforts to push forward on additional relief for the American people. But I just want to be clear that there are abundance of turkeys available. They're about $1 more for a 20-pound bird, which is a huge bird if you're feeding a very big family. And that's something that, again, we've been working to make sure people have more money in their pockets to address it as the economy is turning back on.
Now, a far better way of asking that question, because let's keep it real, right? The right wing, reporters like Peter Doocy are trying to pretend as if they're concerned about the economic anxieties that Americans are facing today. I don't buy that for 1 second. And I think that the lack of sincerity in those very issues leads to Doocy asking the question or framing the question in such a terrible way. What I mean by terrible is, no, why don't you ask why it is that Joe Biden, a Democratic president, thinks it's a good idea to vacation in the home of a private equity billionaire who, by the way, co-founded the Carlyle Group alongside Glenn Youngkin, who just beat, the Democratic incumbent in the gubernatorial race for Virginia. Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, lost to Glenn Youngkin. One of the things that Democrats are supposed to dislike about Youngkin, other than the fact that he's a political opponent, is that he's a private equity guy, and private equity guys, not good, bad, right? Now, private equity guys are not good. They are bad, and I'll explain why in just a second. But it just, just based on optics alone, it's not a good look, right? But then you also have to keep in mind that this sends the message that I think a lot of American voters are kind of privy to at this point, that when it comes to a lot of the bread and butter issues, when it comes to the substantive political ideology that impacts our everyday lives, there's a lot of agreement between Democrats and Republicans. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Carlyle Group, and more importantly, another decision made by the Biden administration just recently that I think needs to tie into this story. So Carlyle specialized in buying and selling businesses that relied on government spending, and it hired former government officials to help it. Carlyle partners included James Baker III, a former Treasury Secretary, Peter Carlucci, a former Defense Secretary. Also, don't forget about former President George H.W. Bush, who was once an advisor to the firm. Now, just this week, Biden made the decision to reappoint Jerome Powell as the Federal Reserve's chair. Now, Jerome Powell was appointed by Donald Trump. And it's a little curious, right, that Biden has decided, I'll just reappoint the guy. Now, Jerome Powell has been a little disastrous, especially considering the monetary policy coming out of the Federal Reserve, both before the pandemic and then how it basically went into overdrive during the pandemic. We've talked about, quantitative easing on this show before. I'll get back into it again. But in terms of inflation, the Federal Reserve has had a big role in creating inflation in certain sectors of the economy, especially when we're talking about the housing market, because these private equity firms, right? Private equity firms like BlackRock, for instance, will get this access to cheap money from the Federal Reserve, and they invest it in residential real estate, which they then turn into rentals, right? Thus, taking the limited supply of housing out of the market, keeping it for themselves, hoarding this real estate for themselves in order to corner the rental market. We've seen that with BlackRock, and we see it with Carlyle Group as well. And so, on one hand, you see the administration get hit hard by fears of inflation. On the other hand, what Biden just did in reappointing Fed Chair Jerome Powell, it just exacerbates the inflation that we're already experiencing, which is obviously going to hurt him politically even further, because Democrats don't know what they're doing, right? They're so blinded by their own cozy ties to Wall Street that they honestly hurt themselves politically, both when it comes to optics and when it comes to how these cozy ties lead to policies that actually hurt their own base. So with that said, let's talk a little more about Jerome Powell's role in the Federal Reserve and his close ties to the Carlyle Group, right? Because this is very much a relationship of give and take. Carlyle Group loves Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell loves Carlyle Group. He actually used to work for them. So in the early 2000s, Powell was a partner at the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm that specialized in hiring former government officials and cashing in on their connections. At Carlyle, Powell learned firsthand about debt-driven business models of private equity business, which delivered hundreds of millions of dollars of profit to senior partners while saddling the companies they bought and sold with debt and downsizing. I mean, we've seen this happen with companies like Toys R Us, for instance. Toys R Us is doing pretty well, but a private equity firm comes in, saddles the company with so much debt, it becomes untenable. And before you know it, Toys R Us is gone. It goes bankrupt. A lot of activity from private equity firms usually involves that kind of business tactic. Now, Jerome Powell, is also a disaster because he's in charge of continuing the monetary policy, again, that has led to inflation in certain sectors of our economy. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve created roughly 3 times as much money as it had created between 1913 and 2007. In other words, it crammed about 300 years worth of money growth into a few short years. And then when COVID hit in 2020, the Fed printed about another 300 more years worth of money in a period of months, some $3 trillion. So the idea here is, oh my God, we're experiencing an economic downturn. We need to help the banks. We need to help these private equity firms, because if we provide capital, if we provide liquidity, they're then going to engage in trickle-down economics and they're going to save the economy. But it doesn't quite work that way. So the Fed doesn't create dollars in the bank accounts of ordinary Americans, as was reported in Fortune. Rather, it can only create dollars inside the bank vaults of 24 elite institutions on Wall Street called primary dealers, which include banks like JP Morgan and Citigroup. When the Fed prints money, it essentially engages in an extreme form of trickle-down economics, a failed model, of course, by giving new cash to the biggest banks in America in hopes that they will eventually create jobs and boost wages. Now, that doesn't typically work out the way that we hope it does, or work out the way that the Federal Reserve would have you believe. Because they take that money, they take the cheap money from the Fed, and they make investments on their behalf. They buy real estate, right? Gobbling up the limited inventory of homes on the market, homes that typically would be bought by a couple looking to start a family, for instance. They do corporate stock buybacks. That's another example of themselves, like, using an economic crisis and the monetary policy from the Federal Reserve to further enrich themselves, to artificially inflate the value of their shares, right? And then you go to, Biden reappointing Jerome Powell when his monetary policy has been pretty disastrous in regard to inflation. And then all of a sudden you notice, oh, well, Powell's got ties to the Carlyle Group. Biden's hanging out in the home of the Carlyle Group co-founder. It's a small club, but they're all talking, and I feel like they're all working together. So many years of easy money policies by the Federal Reserve have been rocket fuel for private equity firms like the Carlyle Group, because cheap debt is their lifeblood. It funds their ambitious takeover plans and even funds their paychecks directly. So everything is connected, everything is tied. The Biden administration, Biden specifically, has gotten a lot of heat for reappointing Jerome Powell as the chair of the Federal Reserve. That just happened recently. He's getting heat for that. So I don't know. I would argue that a savvy president who might be a little concerned about optics wouldn't go hang out in the home of the, Carlyle, co-founder, co-CEO, knowing full well that that individual had and has a working relationship with the very person that you just reappointed. They love the cheap money. They love the Fed's monetary policy, even though it has negative impacts on our economy. And it's just, it all makes sense when you look at it. At the end of the day, it's just this club where decisions are not made on behalf of what's best for the American people. It's all about self-dealing. Carlyle Group loves Jerome Powell. They know Jerome Powell. Really, they've worked with Jerome Powell. They know what kind of monetary policy Jerome Powell will continue, the quantitative easing, which private equity firms like Carlyle Group will take full advantage of to enrich themselves. So that's what the question Peter Doocy was asking should have really gotten to. That's what the framing should have been about. The corruption, the close ties between our government and the banking industry, our government and Wall Street firms. That's the real issue here. But the problem is when you're a faux populist and you don't actually care about the ordinary American getting screwed over, you're not going to quite frame your question in a way that isn't so friendly to private equity or to Wall Street. So there you have it. There I am unpacking what's really going on with Biden's cute little vacation during Thanksgiving break.